Chapter 5. Planning the European Supergrid. The EU reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% since 1990, and it has less than 3 decades to obliterate the remaining 70%. The European Green Deal legal commitment to decarbonise requires a transformation of Europe's energy sectors unparalleled to anything in history in terms of scale, impact, and pace. The transition from a largely coal-based global energy supply in 1900 to economies based on liquid and solid fossil fuel has lasted more than a century. Energy accounts for 3/4 of EU greenhouse gas emissions. A carbon-free electricity supply and electrification of heat and transport to the greatest extent practicable are preconditions for decarbonising Europe's economies. The EU renewable energy share increased by only 10 percentage points, from 9% in 2005 to 19% in 2019 and 23% in 2022. The share of renewables in the electricity sector increased from 15% in 2005 to 44% in 2023, with wind and solar for the first time producing more than a quarter of the EU's electricity, 27%, while fossil generation fell to less than a third. Renewable electricity production more than doubled from 500 terawatt-hours in 2005 to 1,200 terawatt-hours in 2023. Despite this golden period of growth for renewable power in Europe, electricity's share of overall EU gross final energy consumption has remained largely unchanged, below 25%, for the past 15 years. Over the last 30 years, electricity's share of energy has increased by only 5 percentage points. It needs to more than double to 50% before 2040 in order to reach the Green Deal decarbonisation objectives. Moreover, large amounts of electricity will be needed to produce hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels in hard-to-abate sectors, such as industrial processes, and to power the next AI-enabled digital age. Europe now has all the prerequisites to make the necessary transition towards a decarbonised economy based on renewable electricity. It has access to capital at relatively low rates. Though inflation forced up rates in recent years, affordable renewable energy generation technologies are available in abundance in the form of solar power, onshore and offshore wind, and battery storage, and data can be processed at unprecedented speed. Identify and eliminate infrastructure bottlenecks. A high proportion of new power generating capacity needed will come in the form of offshore renewables, for which little grid infrastructure currently exists. Whether Europe manages to build out its electricity infrastructure in time will be the main determinant of its ability to decarbonise its economies. The Florence School of Regulation, FSR, is one of Europe's best-regarded independent organisations for research into EU energy, climate and transport policy and regulation. In an FSR study on cost-effective decarbonisation, authored by former Energy Commissioner Andris Piebalgs and his former Head of Cabinet Christopher Jones, it is concluded that, aside from energy efficiency, the most important and immediate priority for the EU in ensuring a cost-effective decarbonisation of its energy system must therefore be to identify and eliminate infrastructure and other bottlenecks that are likely to constrain the cost-effective production and use of renewable electricity moving forwards. In spite of recent efforts to row back on some of its core targets, and some states and major corporations resiling from net zero commitments by 2050, the EU Green Deal means we must prepare for the biggest energy transformation in history, and it must happen at a speed unparalleled in history. If we get it wrong, If we deploy suboptimal infrastructure, it will cost jobs and European competitiveness. If we get it right, the commercial opportunities and environmental impacts will be vast. A pan-European grid. Europe needs dramatically increased power system capability and flexibility in the coming decades to accommodate those indigenous renewables that will deliver our energy independence and competitive energy prices. This must be provided for by increased interconnection and innovative grid infrastructure, not least in the offshore space where few grids currently exist. Today, Europe is to a large extent applying a national approach to cross-border infrastructure planning, and we are slowly, very slowly, moving towards a regional approach. We urgently need a pan-European approach. This means a coordinated approach to renewable development supported by a grid that can ensure security of supply and keep the lights on for all countries without the burning of fossil fuels. The challenges of realising such a grid centre around the following institutional issues: creating a Europe-wide multilateral governing body, designing, building and operating the offshore infrastructure, setting up an independent system operator, a European ISO, establishing principles for ownership, appointing a Europe-wide regulator, financing the infrastructure, and establishing a tariff regime. Decarbonisation is an ambition shared with the closest neighbours and partners of the European Union. In the normal course of events, the EU is best placed to corral the 27 nations of the EU into an agreement. More than 35 years have passed since the signing of the Single European Act, establishing an internal market based on 4 freedoms: the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people throughout the EU. Today, the free exchange of electricity through cross-border infrastructure is still heavily restricted. As of now, there is no single market for electricity. The challenges of energy independence and decarbonisation are exacerbated by the variable nature of our indigenous renewable resources and needed growth in electricity demand. The energy union is incomplete and will remain so until we create the necessary grid infrastructure, allowing us to tap the vast offshore renewable energy potentials of the European seas and the solar in the south, and link it to consumers throughout Europe. In the US, a model covering all the nation's electricity grids was run to analyse a system where all Western states would reach 60% renewable electricity and all Eastern states would reach 70% renewable electricity by 2030. According to Microsoft founder Bill Gates, the researchers found that by applying a national approach rather than a state-by-state approach, the emission reduction goals could be met with 30% fewer renewables. By building renewables in the best locations and transmitting electricity to where it is needed through a unified national grid. Similar results apply to Europe. A 2022 study by University College Dublin found that a fully connected pan-European energy transmission system can reduce energy costs by up to 39% compared with a business-as-usual approach, and that the costs of transmission are insignificant compared with the cost savings in generation investment. The bulk of the European population lives in mainland Europe, which is also where the greatest need for electricity exists. It is very much in the interests of Norway, the UK, and the EU to jointly plan and become integral parts of a more interconnected European multilateral framework, to be able both to export and to balance electricity generation from their waters. What needs to be established is a Europe-wide system where access to green electricity would be available to all citizens. This could only happen if there were a grid wide enough in scope to allow it. Planning, developing, and operating such a grid would require a Europe-wide governance system with a governing body at its core, comprising the Ministers for Energy for all participating countries, including the Council of the European Union. They would charge an executive, the architect, to draw up plans for the design and deployment of the grid. The interests of the various nations would be reconciled at the governing body level. The governments must include those of nations bordering the EU sea basins, as defined, for example, by the revised Regulation on Trans-European Networks for Energy, 10E, the main EU regulatory framework for cross-border energy infrastructure, and relevant third countries, in particular the UK, Norway, and Northern African nations. Ideally, countries not bordering a European sea basin should be allowed to participate, similar to how Luxembourg participates in the North Seas Energy Cooperation, NSEC, on developing an offshore grid. The European Grid Architect. To build the necessary offshore infrastructure, Europe needs an architect that applies a European perspective to offshore electricity infrastructure development and its interactions with the onshore grid. The current national or regional trial and error approach will prove prohibitively expensive for Europe's economies. We are under severe time constraints, and incrementalization will get us nowhere near the target before 2050. Therefore, we need to get it right from the start. It requires optimization and planning at European level and speed in execution. The office of the architect would be established and appointed by the governing body. This office would take its mission, its values, its marching orders from the governing body, which would consist of representatives of the governments participating in a long-term multilateral infrastructure plan in coordination with the European Commission. The architect should not own any assets. Its job would be, in the initial phases, to turn the vision of the Green Deal into a coherent plan to develop the grid infrastructure to support a European renewable energy system, to bring such energy to market in a cost-effective way that delivers clean, affordable, and secure energy to consumers in participating nations. To do this, an allocation of renewables for Europe and an overall European grid outline would be needed. Analysis would have to be done of the quantities of electricity to be moved from where it could most cost-effectively be harvested to the centres of demand. It would be expected that there will be attempts by various nations to propose the lion's share for their own jurisdiction. Therefore, such national allocations can only be done at governing body level. However, as soon as there is general agreement in the governing body, the architect takes it and begins to specify where and when the first and subsequent parts of the grid should be built. Considering the medium-term and long-term decarbonisation targets of the European countries, the architect would be mandated to identify the renewable energy resources available, identify the need for direct and indirect, hydrogen and its derivative fuels, renewable electricity, develop scenarios, conduct market and network studies, and identify infrastructure and innovation gaps. Conduct optimization studies with constraints, environmental, technical, planning, to arrive at the best infrastructure design for delivering net zero targets in Europe. Update to reflect significant changes to optimums driven by technology advancement and changed demand expectations. There should be clear interaction between the architect, the European Commission, member states, neighbouring nations, European Transmission System Operators, TSOs, and funders, including the European Investment Bank. The architect should liaise with the R&D funders and coordinators of national and EU research programmes, as there will be technological developments required to bridge the gap between an unconstrained allocation of generation and a transmission or system constraint allocation, which should be the recipients of R&D funding. The architect would estimate the necessary power requirements over the short, medium, and longer terms. It must also be granted access to all relevant information and data necessary for operating, maintaining, and developing the offshore infrastructure and the interaction and development of onshore grids. In parallel to the planning and system operations activities, the architect should establish an infrastructure research and innovation program to ensure that European industry develops the best and most innovative infrastructure technology solutions for both domestic use and exports. In time, the architect will develop into a European Independent System Operator, EISO, tasked with developing and operating the pan-European grid to meet the needs of participating countries. The EISO will be responsible for building out the next and subsequent sections of the supergrid based on a long-term optimized supergrid infrastructure plan with a time horizon of at least 20 years. It should start allocating renewable capacity and infrastructure tenders in accordance with such a plan. A similar model is applied to gas infrastructure investments in the North Sea and is used in the United States. The EISO would be responsible for operating and planning the system, specifying the need and tendering for the development of new infrastructure, granting and managing third-party access, collecting charges for operating, developing, and maintaining the system, ensuring the long-term ability of the system to meet demand and decarbonisation targets for 2050 and sub-targets at 5-year intervals, coordinating with national TSOs, infrastructure developers, and asset owners. The architect, EISO, will be completely separated from ownership of the infrastructure and should itself not own any infrastructure assets. The EISO would be responsible for operating the supergrid. Its primary concern would be to keep Europe supplied with electricity. It would route power from where it is being generated to the places of greatest need, just like a national TSO. It is to be decided whether greatest need is measured by local shortage, as indicated by TSOs, and/or by local price signals. The EISO would estimate the necessary power requirements over short, medium, and long-term horizons. All local switching and load management would be carried out by the existing TSO companies. However, EISO would have to interact with every TSO so that it is aware of what the overall load requirements will be in the immediate, short-term, 24 hours ahead, intermediate, 5 days ahead, and longer timeframes, 5 days plus. The EISO will use predictions of upcoming weather patterns as technology allows. It would therefore possess the ability to plan the delivery pattern of renewable generation. There will be periods of oversupply and undersupply. The EISO must manage the supply and demand patterns through these periods. Its applied measures could include, in times of oversupply, charging up utility-scale batteries in various countries, pumping pumped storage across the continent, manufacturing hydrogen from surplus supply. In times of projected undersupply, utilising the existing utility-scale batteries, running down motor vehicle batteries connected to the various national grids, maximising the output from the continent's thermal plants, which at full decarbonisation would be nuclear, biomass, geothermal, or other renewable and dispatchable plant, running pumped storage plants in generating mode, issuing instructions that discretionary loads, such as freezers, for example, have their electricity delivery curtailed for a period. The architect, EISO, will need to inform the scale and location of storage and generation so that it can plan the optimal supergrid. It may be desirable to establish a supervisory board for the supergrid operator, comprising the individual TSOs with a CEO and executive team reporting to it. Financing and ownership of the supergrid. In principle, the pan-European offshore grid infrastructure could be owned by anyone, such as national TSOs, pension funds, private companies, individuals, or governments. Ownership could even be established through competition. However, it is vital that the transmission system owner will not in any way be involved in the processes of granting and managing third-party access or investment planning. The owners would receive a regulated rate return. Investors in the individual countries, including TSOs, pension funds, or the countries themselves, could also own the grid through shareholdings in one European supergrid company or several regional ownership companies. The existing owners of transmission grid assets could compete with newcomers in the auctions for various legs of the grid. The European supergrid owners would be responsible for lending support and providing relevant information and data to the architect, ensuring efficient management of the interfaces between the offshore grid and onshore connections. Models exist as to how this could be accomplished, such as the Midwest Independent System Operator (MISO) system in the US, Canada. Financing the investments decided by the architect, EISO, and approved by the regulatory authority. See below. Providing for the coverage of liability relating to the network assets. Providing guarantees to facilitate the financing of network expansions and research and innovation programs. There is, in principle, no reason why each major element of the supergrid could not be contestably built for lower cost with competition. The tender would set out technical, functional, and performance specifications for a circuit and/or node as required based upon agreed standards. Careful management of the various interfaces would be a feature of the tendering, as well as the operations and maintenance protocols. The owner of a particular leg could be any company who bids the cheapest, with the lowest rate of return, and meets the technical standards. As it would be impossible to predict how much electricity would be flowing at any point in time, the owner may require a guaranteed rate of return on the capital employed. In bidding, developers would bid a capital cost and a certain rate of return they expect to achieve. Payment, therefore, cannot mirror what happens with generation assets, where the owner is paid for the kilowatt hours delivered. The above method could be the way to get the early legs funded and built. At later stages in the build-out, competitions could potentially be held on a different basis. The owners would be responsible for the maintenance of the supergrid to a standard set by the EISO. Infrastructure agreements would be established between the owner of a specific leg and the EISO. With different owners of various sections of the meshed grid, it would be natural for the tender documents to specify that the owners have responsibility for the maintenance of the section of the grid that they build. This is certain to lead to many interfaces, which the arrangements must address. In the event of a fault, where exactly did it occur? It could have been at an interface between one section and a termination point. To obviate these types of issues, an overall maintenance program would be established by the EISO to schedule whatever outages are needed and to maintain the system security and operability of the entire grid in an analogous manner to how national TSOs manage national maintenance outage planning and security of supply. Governing arrangements for an offshore model, such as the one outlined above, would need to be formalised. The governing body of the architect must empower a single Europe-wide regulator to approve tariffs and rates of return on the assets employed. It would also be tasked with dividing the cost and usage by country and with approving investments and financing arrangements. The main task of the regulator must be to serve European and participating nations' consumers' interests by ensuring effective competition, high efficiency, the lowest possible consumer prices in the short, medium, and long term, technology innovation support, and security of supply. A significant part of its work would be to ensure that competitions or auctions are fairly run, and that there is an appeals body to hear complaints from customers, competitors, TSOs, etc. The regulator must also ensure that progress is made towards meeting the medium and long-term climate and energy targets agreed by the governing body, and promote infrastructure technology research and innovation. The regulator must ensure investment decisions are made in accordance with the energy efficiency first and do no significant harm principles. If the competition to build various legs of the supergrid is structured properly, it will be possible to use project finance. This would involve commercial borrowings from banks, sponsors, equity, and possibly a mezzanine tranche. The markets will perceive those risks as high at the beginning of any new venture. This will be reflected in the expected rate of return. There are important roles for the EIB and EBRD, the International Finance Corporation, IFC, national finance institutions, and sovereign wealth funds, not least in the early stages of the rollout. The principle that the customer pays for the service provided is the operating principle underlying the payment philosophy. The tariff design for connecting offshore renewable generation assets should provide incentives for efficient network use. However, it is equally important that the tariffs also provide for the financing and cost recovery of the grid connection. An increasing proportion of electricity will be generated outside the boundaries of the consuming state, and individual generation assets will feed power into several markets with significantly different charging and tariff regimes in place, such as deep, shallow, and extra-shallow charging. Therefore, the governing body must be tasked with aligning the different national rules and applying a harmonised tariff structure throughout the supergrid. The regulator must be tasked with enforcing and monitoring the market rules. One solution could be to average the price of imported electricity from all supplying countries and to charge that in the consuming state. There would have to be additional charges for the supergrid costs. These would be levied on the customer as a separate line item, in much the same way as transmission use of system TUOS charges are currently levied. There would be a distinct time element in the charges associated with the supergrid. In the early stages of the deployment, generating plants near the shore, in shallower water, would be built. The grid costs associated with these would be less than would be the case when more remote generators and a longer meshed grid becomes the norm. There is a case to be made for European financial support to apply to the early stages of rollout of the supergrid, just as is done today through the EU Trans-European Networks framework of projects of common interest and projects of mutual interests. The European Investment Bank also has a large role to play. Analysis from McKinsey & Co. estimates that the investment in new infrastructure and systems that will be needed to meet international climate goals could be $9.2 trillion annually through 2050. That's at least $3.5 trillion more a year than the world is currently laying out for both low-carbon and fossil fuel infrastructure. The team identified 9 key requirements that include not only low-carbon infrastructure, but also new supply chains to produce it, large changes to capital allocation and finance, and institutions and public support strong enough to complete the task. Advanced technology is required, but is not enough on its own. Later chapters deal with the capital allocation issue and explain how the world is not dealing with the issue of supporting the huge investment needed to decarbonise. Master planning the European supergrid, applying mega project thinking. Considering the enormous investment required and the science-based deadlines for decarbonisation of our energy system and wider economy, every effort should be made to avoid what Professor Bent Fleibsberg calls the iron rule of project management. That mega projects are over budget, over schedule, under benefits, over and over again, Fortunately, as he notes in his highly acclaimed 2023 book with Dan Gardner, How Big Things Get Done, when it comes to limiting cost and schedule overruns, solar power, energy transmission, and wind power projects are in fact the best performers across all categories in his enormous database of global megaprojects. Fleischberg identifies that this is due to the inherent modularity and the benefits of the experience curve associated with deploying these technologies, continuous improvement as each turbine, solar panel, or cable is installed. This is also why we have seen such rapid cost reductions in wind, solar, and battery storage over the last decade, and why, as we describe in later chapters, we have confidence for the same trajectory for floating offshore wind. The European supergrid, as a whole, presents a complex challenge that requires serious master planning, however. Recent granular studies for the United States and Australia put the size of the challenge into perspective. One middle-of-the-road scenario for Net Zero America calls for wind and solar deployment rates to at least double historical maxima for the rest of this decade, and double again in each subsequent decade till 2050. It also calls for a doubling of electricity transmission by 2035 and a further doubling by 2050. Thus, the European Supergrid Programme is a mega programme of mega projects. Drawing from the expertise on mega project management is highly relevant to ensure the successful execution of this ambitious endeavour. Key principles from mega project management research, as undertaken by Oxford Global Projects, OGP, and its founders, Professor Bent Fleischberg and Dr. Alexander Budzier, are set out below with thanks to OGP. By applying these principles, the European supergrid can be master planned with the precision and foresight needed to overcome the inherent risks and complexities of mega projects. Planning from right to left. Start with the end goal of a fully decarbonised power economy in 2050 and work backward to identify the necessary milestones and inchstones that need to be achieved to get there. Part of this includes defining a critical path by outlining the key steps and timelines required to reach the 2050 vision. This will generate a sense of urgency and help prioritise resources effectively. The planning from the right also allows the creation of a compelling narrative that has a broad appeal. Identifying the why of the project is central to the narrative. Building a supergrid will speak to a wide range of stakeholders, from the financiers of new infrastructures to the planners, the engineers, the builders, and users, but also the directly impacted communities that will see new energy infrastructure emerge in their backyards. Getting clarity about the different narratives of what is in it for me allows for better stakeholder engagement and alignment behind the individual pieces that will make up the supergrid. The big why. Clarity of purpose. Unification under a single transient organisation is required to unify the planning and execution process under a single determined organisation or architect as outlined in the previous section. This should include a team of independent master architects free from the constraints of existing or traditional organisational structures that ensure innovation and unbiased planning. A good recent example of this is the Darlington project in Canada, where nuclear power reactors have been refurbished on time, on budget, and on benefits. A first for the nuclear industry in over 40 years. We suggest the why as the 4 imperatives set out in the introductory pages of this book to achieve energy security, regional competitiveness, the climate imperative, and improved public health by removing anthropogenic air pollution. This leads to our North Star, complete energy independence for a Europe free from fossil fuels before 2050. This is achieved through the delivery of 100% clean, secure, affordable and price-stable energy for all. Enable and foster collaboration and cooperation. The standard approach in European projects has been to divide and conquer. However, in an industry as fast-moving as energy, this will lead to a large number of local design adaptations that will be less optimal for the whole system. Therefore, there needs to be a central hive mind that brings together innovation, ensures interoperability, and acts as a coordinating centre. That does not mean that all decisions need to be centralised. This will create inefficiencies and slow projects down. But we need an architect responsible for enforcing cross-national collaboration, cooperation, and knowledge exchange. The transient organisation should also comprise the planning process to include dedicated teams for infrastructure and market design. For the European supergrid, a single electricity market in Europe is essential for promoting the required investment in generation and transmission. This market design should be centrally master-planned, employing a top-down approach that ensures alignment with the overarching goals of the European supergrid. The single electricity market must be designed to facilitate rapid and scalable investment, leveraging a master plan that integrates infrastructure and market design requirements seamlessly. We present a deep dive in Chapter 12. Thus, having one transient organisation, as opposed to many independently managed projects, ensures that stakeholders are aligned and maximum efficiency whilst working towards the common, well-defined goal. Think slow, act fast. Pressure to avoid the worst effects of climate change demands that, despite the dangers of rushing to net zero, a slow transition is not an option. But key elements of the think slow, act fast mantra with regards to project planning can and must be implemented to ensure better project performance than we see from current mega projects across sectors. Because time is pressing, one might be enticed to crush the front-end planning for projects. Nothing could be more disastrous. OGP has learned through its research on mega projects in other sectors, again and again, that the mantra is to think slow, to act fast. The key question is that the time required in the early phases of projects, e.g. for licensing and permitting, rights of way acquisition, public consenting, etc., is not wasted by simply waiting on the next approval, but used productively to think about how more innovation could be brought into the project. Key elements to think slow about are how can we design the supergrid for manufacturing, modular installation, how do we increase quality and lower risk, operations and maintenance cost for the future, etc. Commit not to commit too soon. Scrutinise assumptions. Thorough examination of all assumptions and looking for potential flaws is crucial for any project. For mega projects, this particularly includes being aware of cognitive biases such as optimism bias and strategic misrepresentation, which can lead to overestimation of benefits and underestimation of costs and timelines. Avoiding premature commitment is about delaying commitment until all critical aspects have been thoroughly evaluated and validated. This approach includes iterative planning, where plans are continuously tested, refined, and iterated until all, or most, uncertainties and challenges are ironed out. This method ensures that risks of delay and overspend are minimised, whilst agreed benefits are delivered. Furthermore, continuous refining and reiterating of plans based on feedback and new information should take place throughout the mega project. This helps build confidence in the plan and mitigate potential risks. Further, in some areas, we will find that technology is moving on rapidly. In those cases, there might be a value in not being the first mover and waiting for another innovation cycle of product generations to take place. The value of experience. One of the key success factors for mega project performance is an experienced team. Hire the master builder and the team behind the master builder. For the European supergrid, this means ensuring that the master architect and executive functions are filled with experienced program and mega project planning personnel. This significantly increases the likelihood of successful navigation of the complexities of the European supergrid and of delivering the program on time, budget, and benefits. Learn from similar projects. There is no absolute uniqueness, and recognizing that not even a European supergrid is unique is important. Even the European supergrid can learn from similar projects, which will improve the likelihood of successful project planning, funding, and execution. Looking to past completed projects allows for best practice and lessons learned to be identified from, e.g., other large-scale transmission projects to inform the planning process of a European supergrid. What is your Lego? Modular design. Adopting a modular approach to project design, like Lego blocks, allows for flexibility and scalability. Transmission-based projects can be ideal candidates for modular design and construction methods, enabling the European supergrid project to incorporate steep, positive learning curves and more quickly respond and adapt to changes and challenges as they arise. Progress. Since the first edition of this book, the need for and urgency of greater European cooperation in planning and developing Europe's power grids have received great recognition, not least from the member states of the European Union, which, historically, have been reluctant to hand over sovereignty in the field of electricity supply. The breakthrough came when Belgium took over the presidency of the European Union, placing European cooperation on electricity grids at the very top of its political agenda, under the competent leadership of Energy Minister Tin van der Straeten, in the role of Chair of the Council of Energy Ministries. Many of the elements of a workable governance structure for a European supergrid outlined in this chapter were suggested by energy ministers as conclusions to their meeting on the 30th of May 2024. Energy Council Chair van der Straeten told the press following a meeting of energy ministers, "The Council conclusions reflect the European Union's ambition to become more green, competitive and resilient in the energy sector, emphasising the need to roll out an EU supergrid to incorporate more renewables, support electrification, stabilise prices and increase energy security. Great ideas will eventually be brought to life, but policy changes take time, especially in a rigid, highly regulated energy sector characterised by powerful vested interest." Eddie O'Connor conceived the idea of the supergrid in 2001, initially to compensate for wind energy's inherent variability. It took more than 2 decades for EU energy ministers to collectively recognise the benefits and opportunities for Europe of the supergrid. But on the 30th of May 2024, they did. With the meeting conclusions, EU energy ministers unanimously agree to cooperate on achieving a fully integrated, interconnected and synchronised European power system in order to achieve a genuine energy union, which is a key benefit underlying investment in grids. They also instruct the European Commission to improve the governance framework at EU level concerning the planning, selection and implementation of cross-border infrastructure. More about this in the chapter on Europe. Chapter Key Points. 1. The EU reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% in the last 33 years. It has less than 3 decades to eradicate the remaining 70%. 2. The share of renewables in the electricity sector increased from 15% in 2005 to 44% in 2023. However, electricity's share of overall EU energy consumption has remained largely unchanged, below 25% for the past 15 years. 3. Whether Europe manages to build out its electricity infrastructure will be the main determinant of its ability to decarbonise its economies. 4. The costs of building transmission are insignificant compared with the cost savings in generation investment. Bill Gates reckons 30% fewer renewables would be needed to reduce greenhouse gases if renewables were built in the best locations and transmitted through an inter-regional grid. 5. We must undertake the biggest energy transformation in history, and it must happen at a speed unparalleled in history. If we deploy suboptimal infrastructure, it will cost jobs and European competitiveness. 6. The current national or regional approach of trial and error and incrementalism will get us nowhere near decarbonisation and prove wasteful and prohibitively expensive for Europe's economies. 7. We urgently need a pan-European electricity grid that can deliver energy independence while keeping all customers' lights on, without the burning of fossil fuels. 8. To build the necessary offshore infrastructure, Europe needs an architect that applies a European perspective to offshore electricity infrastructure development and its connection with the onshore grid. 9. Building the EU-wide supergrid requires a multilateral governing body, an independent system operator, EISO, a European regulator, and an independent architect to design the supergrid, make financing arrangements, and develop a tariff regime. 10. The architect should not own any assets. Its initial job would be to turn the vision of the Green Deal into a coherent, long-term plan to develop Europe's grid infrastructure. 11. In time, the architect will develop into a European Independent System Operator, EISO, tasked with developing and operating the pan-European grid. 12. The main task of the regulator must be to serve European consumers' interests by ensuring effective competition, high efficiency, the lowest possible consumer prices in the short, medium and long term, technology innovation support and security of supply. 13. European financial support must be activated from the early stages of rollout of the supergrid, e.g. through the EU Trans-European Networks framework of projects of common interest and projects of mutual interest. The EU framework of Important Projects of Common European Interest, IPCEI, could also be leveraged. 14. The European Supergrid Programme is a mega-programme of mega-projects. Drawing from the expertise on mega-project management is highly relevant to ensure its successful execution. 15. Belgian Energy Minister Tin van der Straeten, on behalf of the 27 EU Energy Ministers, April 2024, the build-out of an EU supergrid will be a crucial enabler for a sustainable, competitive, just and resilient energy transition in the EU. 16. EU Energy Ministers, 30th of May 2024, Council Conclusions. A fully integrated, interconnected and synchronised European power system can only be achieved if the EU's electricity grid infrastructure is deployed and used as effectively and efficiently as possible for exchange of energy. The Council calls on the Commission to come forward with a strengthened framework to increase transparency, traceability, and appropriate independent oversight for the whole transmission grid planning and development process through strengthening the current governance structure by providing for a European grid needs assessment and planning that complies with the EU climate and energy targets and meets the decarbonisation objectives. The Council underlines the importance of aiming to achieve a fully or predominantly decarbonised global power system in the 2030s and the ramp up of electricity infrastructure.